Thank you. So the paper I'm going to present is a new paper written specifically for this event. And in the spirit of Carlos's opening challenge, I'm going to try and respond in that spirit, which was, if you're going to make mistakes, let them be big mistakes. So the paper that I'm going to present, I think, may be guilty of some very big mistakes, and I'm looking forward to an engagement on that base. I think the presentation I'm about to make is either going to be terribly banal, the argument that I'm going to make is terribly banal, or there is some innovation, theoretical innovation in the paper. My sense is that I'm hoping that there's some innovation, but the mistake will be that actually in the end the argument is just basically conceptually thoroughly banal. So these are the stakes, I think, in this paper. And really what I want to think about theoretically is what's happened recently in South Africa, which I see as part of a phenomenon which has been an international phenomenon. I call it elite populism, and I'll discuss that further on in the paper goes. So I think there's a politics which played itself out in South Africa over the last 10 years, which is not dissimilar to a politics that's played itself out in Turkey, in India, potentially even in Venezuela, and in other parts of the world, which I'm calling elite populism. So one has to think around that kind of politics from an international point of view. But what I really want to do is that I want to think about that phenomenon in relationship to democracy and democratic transitions, political transitions. So the claim I'm going to be making is that the phenomena we've seen in South Africa, which I will describe in a moment, constitutes a major democratic reversal. So let me flag at the beginning that in the South African context, this argument is original, precisely because what we've experienced over the last 10 years under the presidency of Jacob Zuma, and I'll tell you more about that in a moment, is largely construed in terms of the politics of corruption. Now, I've been pushing back against that argument for some time now, that what you've been seeing essentially is a large-scale politics of corruption. But what is definitely not done is to think around what's happened in South Africa in relationship to the democratic project. Rather, what the sense is, that what we've experienced over the last 10 years in South Africa, especially over the last couple of years, is a criminal network has seized power of the state. The language which we use, drawn from fairly obscure American political science, is the notion of state capture, which has become a huge analytical term. It's even part of day-to-day conversation. And what it fundamentally expresses is that over the last while, a political network has seized power, has come to occupy state positions, and used its positions in the state essentially for a project of looting or of massive corruption. So again, criminality, corruption. In other work, when I've tried to push back on that and argue that there was informed by there was a political project at work, there's been a lot of resistance to that idea. People are very comforted by the idea that it's essentially criminals which seize power of the state, and now that they're out of power, we can move happily on into this kind of post-Zuma period. Deal with them individually by sending them to jail, and open up a space of moving past the politics of corruption. So I'm very suspicious of those conceptualizations. But what is definitely absent from that debate is this idea of thinking about the last 10 years in relationship to a democratic reversal. And this is really what this paper what I want to think about. So I'm going to make an argument around why it's been very difficult to conceptualize what's happened in South Africa over the last 10 years in terms of a democratic reversal. And I'm going to argue that the reason is essentially conceptual. That what makes what happens in South Africa over the last while invisible from the point of view of democracy is that the conception of democracy that has informed both South African understandings of its transition, but has informed international understandings of transition, is too narrow a conception of democracy to consider that what has happened outside the electoral process or outside the process of governing the rules of political participation as a democratic phenomenon. So that's really where I want to start. if you look at the literature on political transitions, and especially around democratic transition, then you can take your pick of authors. They all come back in the end to very similar conceptions, whether it's Samuel Hunt, whether it's Huntington, even including Przorsky in some of his conceptions, Lynn Stepan, all of them. Ultimately, they treat democracy essentially, in the end, operationally, as a system that applies to rules of political participation and governing how the whole bearers of power are selected. And it's this very narrow conception of democracy which reduces it essentially to the rules of political participation that I think is incredibly informative in the literature around transitions, around democratic transitions, and it's been enormously informative in South Africa. So when thinking around the democratic transition in South Africa, that language and that conceptual language has largely exhausted the way in which we've thought about the South African transition. So, so if one uses the notion of Gagarella's notion of a constitutional drama, one can understand that during the period of democratization, the movement from apartheid to democracy in South Africa, one can understand the South African drama essentially in terms of negotiations or conflicts or debates over the rules of political participation. The understanding was the apartheid was a particular form of authoritarianism, and we'll come back to that analysis in a moment. And essentially what the democratic process in South Africa was of changing the rules of public participation in a way that was opening up to democracy. What is so interesting is the terms of what constituted democracy in South Africa was highly contested, essentially between two primary visions of a democratic polity in South Africa. One, and you'll see this in the 1993 Constitution, those conceptions figure very strongly, so much so that some of the authors are writing about the transition regarded the South African constitutional transition undemocratic, but was largely informed by consociational considerations, which understood South African society as one that was deeply divided. This yes, how do you pronounce it? Yeah, that's how you pronounce his name. Liphart's conception of a deeply divided society, and therefore the measures to which one dealt with that deeply divided society was through all sorts of power sharing arrangements which gave vetoes for minorities and other provisions which institutionalized power sharing between various ethnic groups and in the South African case racial groups. You see those sorts of conceptions figure very strongly in the provisions of the 1993 Constitution, which one can largely say is a consociational model. And in those terms, authors writing at the time were deeply disappointed by the South African transition for its ability to deliver a democratic result. The sense of consociationalism drew on a long apartheid history. Consociational models were incredibly informative for the apartheid government. So, for example, the 1982 Constitution, when I was a child, introduced during the reform period of apartheid, largely drew on consociational conceptions of a deeply divided society. So in 1982, for example, South Africa introduces this constitution. It's called the Tricameral Parliament. It grants a legislative house for coloureds, for Indians, and for whites, governed on this idea that each parliament had jurisdiction over the racial group's own affairs. There was something called the President's Council, which had jurisdiction over general affairs. There were all sorts of mechanisms to give minority vetoes over a whole range of issues. The model was consociational. And if you look at the 1993 Constitution in South Africa, which comes out of the negotiated period, it largely instantiates principles of power sharing with all sorts of minority vetoes as well. So a consociational constitution. It's highly contested, though, by those in the liberation movement coming through the African National Congress on a conception of majority rule. And if you like, you can see, if you use Gagarella's expression of the constitutional drama in South Africa really is between this a constitution which will instantiate majoritarian principles as opposed to consociational principles. At stake, though, are very different conceptions of the nature of South African society. The consociational model drawing on, as I've mentioned, this idea of South Africa as a deeply divided society, essentially between different racial blocs and minority and ethnic groups, which need to be somehow balanced in the new polity, as opposed to a conception which has come through the African National Congress, drawn initially from the South African Communist Party, of South Africa essentially being a colonial society. That the fundamental relationships therefore are not of ethnic groups and of races, but rather a conception of South Africa as one in which the fundamental cleavages are colonial cleavages. A white colonial population in a relationship of colonial domination with the black majority. And therefore constitutional provisions are needed, therefore, not to instantiate minority vetoes, etc., but to overcome fundamentally a colonial relationship by instantiating a principle of majority rule. And if you see the 93 and 96 constitutions, there's a fundamental shift away from those consociational principles in the 1996 constitution. What is so interesting, though, if you look at the debates around whether South African democracy is being consolidated or realized in terms of the transition, the debate is really around whether these new rules of participation, as instantiated in these constitutional provisions, provide for rules of participation which allow democracy, and democracy is conceived on two terms: the possibility of genuine political opposition and the possibilities of a changeover of a turn of power. Very much drawing on the Huntingtonian conceptions of democracy. And essentially what you see in South Africa during the 1990s and early and late 1990s is a sense that largely these constitutional provisions have arrived at a situation where one can regard the South African polity as democratic, and largely that South African democracy is, if not consolidated, it is largely on the route to consolidation. The huge issues around concerns around the idea of South Africa becoming a dominant party system, and the real worries there in terms of democracy around the idea of whether electoral opposition can fully emerge. So here's the great paradox of South Africa. From this point of view, from the point of view of this conception of democracy which is so central to the political transitions literature, I think it's not difficult to say that South Africa has been incredibly successful. Political opposition has emerged over the last 18 months, for example. The political position of the African National Congress has declined; its strength has declined dramatically. We may see a reversal now with its new leadership, but on my calculations, which proved to be pretty accurate to the decimal point, even for the 2016 local government election, the ANC was probably sitting at around 50% of the vote, just 55% of the vote. And I think for a short while during the end of last year, its electoral majority was seriously at risk. Opposition parties have emerged, growing as a growing phenomenon. So if you look at South Africa through the prism of this perspective, if you're using this conception of democracy, one has to say that South Africa is a pretty robust, vibrant democracy. But what this analysis obscures is at the very time when we're celebrating, or someone would be celebrating, the consolidation of democracy, or the movement towards consolidation of democracy in South Africa, something very, very dramatic was happening in other parts of the state. And this is really the puzzle. These other events have never been conceived or were analyzed in terms of the democratic literature, because I think they are invisible from that literature. So what starts, and you can choose the date, and many of you have heard the story before, but I can tell an abbreviated version of it. In 2009 in South Africa, there is a change of power within the African National Congress. Jacob Zuma becomes the president of the ANC. He comes to power within the African National Congress, not yet as president of the country, but as president of the African National Congress, on the back of a wave of disenchantment and even tremendous hostility to the presidency of Thabo Mbeki, his predecessor. And largely what is at stake in that critique of Thabo Mbeki is a profound disillusionment with the political economy of the 1990s. A sense that even though the South African economy grows, in retrospect we realize it's quite extraordinary. We grow at a rate of faster than we've ever achieved, faster than the last 40 years. We hit 5% economic growth per annum, but it comes at tremendous expense of reproducing old historical apartheid relationships of race and exclusion. So there's an emergence of a small black precarious and vulnerable black middle class, massive economic exclusion in the rural areas, shanty towns, on urban periphery. So there's a sense that this economic growth has come to the benefit of a white population and is associated with large-scale black economic exclusion. And what you start seeing from that period is the search for what is regarded as a more radical conception of economic transformation. That the kind of economic transformation pursued under Thabo Mbeki or during the 1990s is one which is premised essentially on recognizing the configuration of the existing capitalist economy as it is, but cajoling or incentivizing or encouraging white businesses, white capital to reform itself through two initiatives. Black economic empowerment by transferring ownership to designated black beneficiaries, and through a policy of affirmative action to change the management structure of white firms. The project is regarded as largely as a failure, having produced a small elite beholden to white firms, but otherwise associated with large-scale exclusion. So you start seeing from the 2007, 2008, the search for more radical conceptions of economic transformation. We have a party now which comes out of the African National Congress called the Economic Freedom Fighters. They return to some of the principles from the 1950s of the Freedom Charter, of nationalizing the commanding heights of the economy, the banks, the mines, etc. But that's not the only view of what a radical model would look like. What you start seeing happening on the edges of the ANC, but also within parts of government, is this idea of using the procurement budgets of state-owned enterprises to do two things: to displace existing white firms and to incentivize or create huge new black-owned and black-controlled industrial enterprises. So there are two large state-owned enterprises in particular in South Africa, one that's responsible for the generation and transmission of electricity, it's called Eskom, and the other one is responsible for the bulk railway network. And an idea is a large-scale project of industrial expansion through the state-owned enterprises to commission new industrial projects where the beneficiaries of this expansion were largely to black-owned and black-controlled firms. It's a very compelling vision of economic transformation. It does not rely on white firms and white capitalists to reform themselves. It's very ambitious. It also speaks to a much longer history in South Africa, an idea that this is how Afrikaners in South Africa achieved economic emancipation from Britain through this project of a state-led development using state-led enterprises. What is so important about this, and I don't want to get into the details, that project from about 2012, for reasons which we can discuss, at some point turns against the Constitution. And the reasons for turning against the Constitution are quite technical and are related to the way it relates to South Africa's Constitution, in particular the configuration of anti-corruption laws, which essentially make rent-seeking practices illegal. But the new project of radical economic transformation is essentially a project of rent-seeking, of legitimizing rent-seeking practices as necessary and as beneficial to the country, and yet our Constitution criminalizes rent-seeking practices. And so what you start seeing from 2012 in particular is a sense that the Constitution is an obstacle to radical economic transformation. Now here's where things get interesting. During this period, from 2012 onwards, 2014, you start seeing quite massive attacks on state institutions. It starts off with the tax authority in South Africa called South African Revenue Services, massive assaults on the autonomy of the administration. It moves on to parts of the police, huge assaults on the police, and then huge assaults on the authority responsible for public prosecutions, called the National Prosecuting Authority. The real target, though, is the National Treasury, as that organ of the state which must uphold constitutional provisions which restrict rent-seeking behaviors. So something very interesting is happening, and this is what makes it invisible from the point of view of democratic theory. You have a massive assault from between 2012 2013 on the state, but the primary targets of that assault are public servants and state officials. They are the people that are being persecuted. They're either being purged from their positions, they're being harassed and persecuted in their jobs on a massive basis. Extraordinary things are happening to public servants and to state officials. But very, very little is happening in the space of the curtailment of democratic rights at the civil or political terms. In other words, if you're looking at democracy simply as a political system related to political participation, there is no assault against the democratic system. There's no assault against the system. So what you have is, on the one hand, the preservation of civil rights, the protection of democratic rights at the level of political rights happening. And so we look like we're this happy, robust democracy on the one hand, but from 2012, a massive, massive assault on the state and our public officials. What I want to argue, though, is that that massive assault on the state constitutes a democratic reversal. That we have to think around this assault on the state also as a democratic reversal, not just as something unrelated to the state of democracy in South Africa. And the argument that I want to make is that in order to do that, we have to rethink our conception of democracy and develop another conception of democracy which is more expansive. I think a conception of democracy that is more faithful to the history of the notion of democracy and the history and more faithful to the concept and also to its historical practice. So what I want to do here is that I want to think around the conception of democracy not simply as rules of electoral participation, but refer to a conception which emerges in French literature in the 70s to Claude Lefort, drawing on a much older conception of democracy, which I think is much more classical and is much more faithful to the history of the term. And that is the idea of democracy as being a particular symbolic form of political community, one which instantiates the principle of undecidability of political outcomes, which electoral rules are merely processes which realize that fundamental principle. But here is at the heart of what the democratic project is really seeks to instantiate materially and symbolically. It's the idea of society as fundamentally heterogeneous. Fundamentally, if we use the language of Derrida, of a society that's fundamentally constituted in difference. One which, moving away from a conception of a society which is premised, which is a totalitarian gesture, which is why I would argue that all forms of nationalism are ultimately totalitarian in their basic genetics. A conception of democracy which instantiates the principle of fundamental difference, that no part of society can ever stand to represent the whole, whether it's a political party standing to represent the whole, or any particular element of society claiming or being able to represent the whole. It's that idea of the undecidability of politics, that symbolic gesture which I think the practice of democracy seeks to instantiate, this idea of the social fundamentally constituted in difference that I think is faithful to the history of democracy. And I think if we work on that conception of democracy, then I think we can start thinking around democracy not just in terms of electoral rules, but we have to think of democracy therefore in a much larger sense in terms of a particular kind of state. And this is really what is at stake here. I think what we saw in 2012, perhaps even earlier in South Africa, this massive assault on the public service and on public servants, I want to conceptualize as an assault on democratic elements of the state. And this is how I want to do it. There is a large literature in development and in public administration around the notion of bureaucracy, and in particular around the notion of bureaucratic autonomy. I think the argument, is largely one, empirically, that bureaucratic autonomy is fundamentally necessary for development and economic growth. Of course, that doesn't necessarily mean that bureaucratic autonomy is related in any way to democracy. You can have bureaucratic autonomy, you can have states that generate economic growth or generate development consequences on both totalitarian, authoritarian, or democratic considerations. So bureaucratic autonomy in this regard is a variable which is independent of the democratic form of the state. I nonetheless, and we can definitely agree that the origins of bureaucracy are certainly unrelated to the history of democracy. But I do think that in its modern form, I think we have to think of a relationship, of a rapport between this conception of bureaucracy and the democratic form of the state, if we use a classical conception as expressed by Lefort of the political community as being instantiated as democracy is instantiated on a system of fundamental difference. So I want to, this is where I've either said something banal or I've said something original. So I want to read from the end of my paper, if I may. So how does one evaluate corruption or predatory behavior in the state from the point of view of democracy? The truth is, it is very difficult to, if one reduces democracy to the rules of political participation. That the orthodoxy in the development community is that good governance and democracy are mutually supportive, there is little evidence to demonstrate this claim empirically. This is why debates about the quality of government tend to be a reference to questions of development and economic growth. Does it mean, therefore, that the relationship between democracy and the state is simply a statistical one between independent variables? Things improve considerably, however, when we expand our conception of democracy in a way that is more faithful to the history of the term and to its practice. Democracy is distinguishable from other political systems, not just by the institutional arrangements that determine how power holders are selected. Democracy, rather, is that system that instantiates political indeterminacy as its basic condition. In the language of Lefort, democratic societies are constructed around a representation of the place of power as an empty space. Totalitarian and even authoritarian regimes ground the political order on the idea of society as homogeneous, the people incarnated in the figure of the leader or the party unified in whole. This is impossible in a democracy that admits ontologically the heterogeneous form of the social, that is, it is constituted in difference. This is why the place of power is necessarily empty. There is no party or part of society that can claim to stand for the whole. Elections and electoral rules, the various procedures and institutions of democracy are there to instantiate the symbolic effect practically. That is not enough, however. The state, its administrative institutions, the bureaucracy, the police, the judiciary, must necessarily be autonomous from political power. A political system that allows a party or a particular group of citizens to fuse with the state accords them an extreme advantage. It would destroy the democratic effect. This is why democratic states must instantiate not just the separation of powers between the legislature, judiciary, and the executive. They must be bound by all sorts of rules and procedures that regulate the relationship between bureaucrats and politicians in two directions, so that the state is in a position to implement the policies of elected politicians, and so that the autonomy of administrations is not breached. What we can call bureaucratic autonomy. So this is the way I've argued that it's possible to think of, even though one could, on the one hand, in terms of the electoral rules, see South Africa as quite a buoyant, vital democracy, see that what we've seen over the last several years in South Africa, and elsewhere I've used the language of a coup d'etat. I think that the notion of a coup d'etat is correct. But understand that coup as being representing a fundamental democratic reversal, provided we understand democracy as more inclusive than the electoral rules, to include a conception of bureaucratic autonomy in relationship to officials, or the bureaucracy in relationship to the political class. And I think this is precisely what is at stake in the violation of democracy in South Africa, is an attempt to eliminate bureaucratic autonomy, an attempt to eliminate the autonomy of the bureaucratic class, an autonomy of public administrations, and subject them directly and immediately to the direct rule and control of a ruling faction. I think that's a totalitarian gesture, and I think therefore this is what South Africa has for the moment survived, but I think that survival is very, very precarious, because I think as long as we continue to understand that what's happened essentially over the last several years, simply in terms of corruption, what we obscure is the relationship of what we've seen over the last several years as a democratic threat, and therefore we are unable to protect the South African democracy going forward. I'll end there.